Hi, Radhika, are you here? Oh, great. We're at time, and I think everybody is in the room. Can I just get a go ahead from the APrIGF team?
Yes, please get started and we'll get the recording started as well.
Super. Thank you so much. Hello
Recording
and welcome,
in
everyone.
progress.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Namrata Maheshwari. I'm Asia Pacific Policy Counsel at Access Now, and I also coordinate the global team's work on encryption. I'll be your moderator today, and in addition to the stellar panelists, I also hope to hear from as many of you as possible. As I'm sure you know, there has been
Recording in progress.
So after the session, we hope that all participants will have a better idea of the policies and measures of our governments and understand the human rights implications of new digital technologies, as well as come up with possible recommendations that will allow governments to implement programs aligned with human rights and data protection standards. And just to give you a flow of this session, so we will each ask our four speakers for the first to give us a general landscape in their respective countries on the privacy intrusion measures used by their government. So we'll give them 5 minutes each for that. And then afterwards, we'll have a follow-up question for each of them. And then we will open the floor for questions. So if you have questions, you can park them now, or if you and then you can either write them in the chat box later on, and we will try to respond to them. Or if you do not have questions, maybe what you can do is to share your experience in your country on how your government is intruding into your privacy, especially so at this time. And yeah, we will try to read all the questions and the sharing of experiences that will be in the chat box. So anyway, since we only have an hour for this session, let us get going. So our first speaker is Jessamine Pasis from the Philippines. So Jess is a program officer at the Foundation for Media Alternatives. So while she works mostly in the areas of privacy and data protection, she also takes interest in related fields like digital labor, cybercrime, and freedom of expression. So Jess, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you also, Pavan, I think, for helping with the slides. So good day, everyone. Like Lisa said, I'm Jess from the Foundation for Media Alternatives in the Philippines. She already said the introduction, so I'll be going straight to the presentation. Next slide, please. So the reason I'm speaking here today is because of this report that we developed at FFA, the one that you're seeing on screen. And it's a report on the various privacy intrusive measures that were introduced by the Philippine government during and in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll be sharing, I can share the link to the paper, to the report, I think after the presentation. Next, please. So the report is basically an attempt to take stock of as many mobile applications, websites, databases, and even policies that we could find. And the ones included here in this slide are just some of them grouped based on their purpose. And I would just like to highlight some of the most notable ones. First, for contact tracing, some of you may be surprised to know that even until today, in September, almost October 2021, the Philippines still doesn't have a proper unified digital contact tracing system. And the first one listed here, SaySafe.ph, is the one that's being officially endorsed by the Philippine government. But even this one, it took them more than a year to complete the turnover process from the private firm that developed the app to the government. And even until I think as recent as August 2021, the Department of Health admitted that not enough people are using Stay Safe, the Stay Safe app for it to actually be effective or create an actual impact. So basically, contact tracing, digital contact tracing is inefficient. But how does this relate to the issue of surveillance? So because of the lack of a unified contact tracing system, local governments and private establishments alike have been relying on their own contact tracing systems, which they either develop themselves or contracted to be developed by a third party. So basically, right now, a multitude of different public and private entities are currently collecting and processing the personal data of Filipinos. And although the government did issue a policy that governs the vetting process for these COVID-related technologies, there is no confirmation or publicly available information that such vetting process is being observed. And also, more importantly, as we are probably aware, as we all are probably aware, under a regime such as the Duterte regime, which has proven time and time again that it will break and bend the law to stifle its critics and silence dissent. Having this much personal information in the hands of a government without much guaranteed safeguards and with very little transparency could be a matter of life and death, and could even impact our democratic processes. In fact, there were reports as early as last year of people who installed some of these contact tracing applications and have been receiving messages from unknown numbers, not just for marketing or advertising of products, but also for political campaign. And I think just to set a context for this, the Philippines will be holding its national elections next year in 2022. So as early as now, people are already campaigning, and activists and advocates are fearing that these contact tracing applications and the personal information collected from them are being used for these political campaigns. And then since we're talking about surveillance, another thing that I wanted to highlight is the one in the bottom row on the enforcement of health protocols, specifically the use of stringent monitoring measures, especially during the early days of the pandemic. So during the early days, COVID-19 related monitoring systems were used to amplify the presence of or even the intimidation by security forces, such as the police and the military. So as you can see here, in some areas, CCTV systems and even drones were employed to be used for real-time monitoring. And the Philippine government even once came out with an official order for police officers to monitor social media posts to identify quarantine violators. And what's interesting to note also is that this was around the same time when several individuals who were critical of the government were targeted and charged with offenses relating to quote unquote the spread of fake news. And in another instance, there was also a progressive activist group who claimed that one of their members was abducted by state forces, and apparently the means by which the police were able to locate that activist was through the contact tracing initiative of the barangay or the town in which that activist was residing. Next. Yes, I will wrap up. Next slide, please. Yes. So this is just a snapshot of some of the issues that we identified, and I will not go through all of them. And some of them I already mentioned, such as the lack of clear standards and unified systems, lack of teeth by the government when it comes to regulating or even vetting these measures, and of course, function creep. Yeah, and I think the most important is how these policies and measures meant to manage the health crisis are being used and now play a role in human rights violations. And since we don't have the luxury of time, these are just some of the issues. But I'll be also interested to hear from our other speakers and our participants as well if you have experienced some of these similar issues in your countries. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jess, for that presentation. Yeah, it really seems that, even contact tracing apps that you have other uses than just being for tracing, your close contacts. So that the function creep that you mentioned. So next, our next speaker is Yi Ting, whose interests lie at the intersection of gender and technology, violence and security. So based in Singapore, the intertwining issues of freedom of expression and assembly and privacy in the restrictive city-state are close to her heart. Yi Ting currently works at the Digital Defenders Partnership, formerly as data protection facilitator and presently as its communications officer. So Yi Ting.
Hi, thanks so much, Lisa and everyone. So allow me to share a short presentation. Let me do this. Okay, so I'm going to be talking briefly about the situation in Singapore and surveillance measures that have been implemented since the pandemic. And I'll do this with three main examples. And the first one, of course, is contact tracing technology. I don't think any state is really free from this now. So in Singapore, we use an app called Trace Together and sometimes a token that combined with these check-in gantries not only traces the people that you've been in proximity to via Bluetooth pings, but also is able to track your location because you need to sign into every location. And one of the more troubling things about this is just Singapore's love of facial recognition technology, right? That when you enter any public space, any public building, shops, and so on, now there's often a temperature scanning device that uses a camera, which is also a facial recognition camera. So in Singapore, there's generally huge amounts of data collected and very little transparency about where all of this data goes and how all of this is used. So one controversy around this was that at the start of the pandemic, the government assured the people that contact tracing data would only be used for public health reasons. But then it was revealed just in January or February this year that as early as May 2020, contact tracing data had already been used in criminal investigations. And this case in particular was a murder investigation, after which, the government apologized. The parliamentarian actually said he forgot that our laws give the police the power to access any data they want at any time, essentially. And so following public outcry, a bill was passed to restrict the use of this contact tracing data to the investigation of serious crimes. But even as this bill is passed, the same law in the Criminal Procedure Code that allows the police to access whatever data they want is still in place. So in effect, this new law really restricts the use of contact tracing data. And even if it does limit it to these 7 serious crimes, it is now being used for criminal investigation outside of public health reasons. And the second example I want to go through is, just generally the surveillance that's built into public infrastructure. So early in the pandemic, drones, CCTV cameras are pretty common, pretty standard in Singapore. And there were some humorous articles written about our pandemic robots, which I've been told look exactly like the robots in an episode of Black Mirror. So since the start of the pandemic till now, these robots have an upgrade. They are now autonomous. And it's framed quite benignly, like this autonomous robot just checks on bad behavior and reminds people to, not gather in groups of more than 5, or now the regulation is groups of 2. But what's worrying about this is that this robot uses 360-degree field of vision So it's essentially recording people in the public all the time. And this footage is being sent back to state agencies. And it is said that state agencies can then send personnel, can then take further action if necessary. So it's quite benign in that it says, oh, they're looking out for errant smokers, illegal hawkers, motorcycle riders on footpaths, and gatherings that exceed the current sizes. But as a reminder, all of these things are actually offenses in Singapore. And since the start of the pandemic, loads of people have been charged with flouting safe distancing measures or not wearing masks. And the penalties are usually fines of thousands of dollars and or jail time. So the longest jail time has been, I think, 30 weeks or something like that. So it doesn't usually go that high. I have to say it's usually between 4 to 6 weeks long, but still that robot is not so benign. I suppose that's my point. And finally, because I know that I am short on time, I think, I'm interested in looking at the surveillance technologies that's being used in education and remote learning. So since the start of the pandemic, a lot of education has moved online, and students are pretty much expected to have their own personal learning device, which is essentially a computer. If you don't have your own, the school will loan you one. And a press release from the Ministry of Education says that this blended learning, this mix of remote learning and in-person learning will actually enhance schooling experience. But one of the things that they announced as part of this was that there's going to be cyber wellness education, where students are taught to recognize online risks, etc. But the personal learning devices that students have that are loaned from the school will be installed with device management applications. And it's supposed to support cyber wellness. But what it actually does is that it's a really intrusive device, right? That allows you to record anything from teachers to track anything from students' browsing history to doing things like shutting down their device from afar. And when public protest emerged over this, the defense from the ministry was that it does not track personal information, it does not track the student's location. But I don't know. I think these are claims that we can be skeptical of. I mean, not only are these applications installed on devices on loan from the school, they're also installed in devices that students purchase on their own. And you'll see that from this sort of petition, online petition, the device does a whole lot of things, right? They can disable the device at any time. They can show you any content that they want. They can see what content you're currently viewing. And this is all done remotely, even when you're not physically in school. Teachers can also run any program that they want on your device, whether it's malicious or not, and control how many hours you spend on the device, blacklist or whitelist programs. And this is a concern because, again, in Singapore, we have no idea where all of this information goes. Students who are LGBTQ, for instance, may have reason to be concerned if they're looking up such material. It's still an offense in the country. And there's no transparency around how long this data is retained, what other government agencies it's being shared with. But from what we can tell, basically this information seems to be kept pretty much forever and shared with pretty much a whole bunch of government or state agencies. So yeah, these are the three things that I want to draw attention to. Thanks so much for time.
Thank you as well, Yiting, for sharing with us what is happening in Singapore, how technology is actually being used by the government in its response to the pandemic. But the thing is that similar, I think, to what Jess mentioned earlier, people don't really know how their data is being used. So our next speaker is Damar Juniarto from Indonesia. So Damar is a prominent human rights activist known for his work on digital rights and online freedom of expression in the Southeast Asian region. So Damar is the Executive Director of the Southeast Asia Freedom of Expression Network, or SafeNet, a regional organization focused on promoting and protecting digital rights in Southeast Asia. Hi, Damar.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for introducing me. Warm greeting for everyone who attend this session. So I will begin with how the state surveillance amid the pandemic happened in Indonesia. So in the early phase of...
Sorry to interrupt. Can you move the window in front? Yes. Oops. Nope, you should close it.
Sorry.
Yeah. And just only show your slides, please.
Okay, one moment, please.
No worries. Yep, it's perfect.
Okay, we'll continue. Sorry. So the early phase of COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia, the government wants to drag down the situation into an emergency situation. That is something more like a military emergency rather than health emergency. So this one, during that time, the government puts public safety on the wrong spectrum. The right to public safety is translated into public security. So everything is translated into the genre of security. So the security approach affects on the surveillance activities and also the new policies during the pandemic, which should provide protection for the people, but later threatening the communities. I will emphasize, I will highlight three surveillance activities amid a pandemic in Indonesia. One is the massive surveillance. So right after the pandemic hits Indonesia in March 2020, the President Jokowi gave instruction to the state intelligence bodies to tackle any situation that causing public order. A month later, the police started actively control the narration, especially in the social media, on the online spaces. With this telegram letter, date April 4, 2020, the Chief of National Police gave instruction to carry out cyber patrols to monitor opinions in cyberspace with the target of those who spreading hoaxes related to COVID-19. That's the first one. The second one, hoaxes related to government policies in anticipating the spread of the COVID-19 outbreak. And the third one, those who insult the president or ruler or government officials. And another telegram letter was released on October 2nd, 2020 with an instruction to do counter narratives. But later this year, starting in February 2021, the Indonesia police roll out a virtual police who will surveil 24/7 on the social media platform. With these new policies, the police have power to send messages directly to the netizen as virtual alert. The virtual alert consists of warning and also an order to delete a post. These virtual police actually create a new fear where no more privacy and no more freedom of expression, especially on online spaces for Indonesian people. The second highlights, I think, coming from the health surveillance. So following Singapore government who successfully launched Trace Together, the Indonesian government released contact tracing apps named Peduli Lindungi. This was launched in the end of March 2020 by the MICT. And then this, an audit actually being rolled out by Digital Reach and Citizen Lab. They found out that this Peduli Lindungi version 2.2.2 using Bluetooth sensoring technology that sending out users Wi-Fi MAC address and local IP address, so the data collector can trace the of anyone who download the apps. The latest version of Peduli Lindungi then introduced, but still leaves some issues, especially the data protection of the users. Now with the wider use of Peduli Lindungi, which is not only contact tracing apps, but others, but provide others like the vaccine certificate. Even later, if you going to the mall, you must show the Peduli Lindungi, and also for buying stuff. This is raising the issue on who own this user's data, because people store a lot of specific information, such as their ID number, but also this application collecting data on the picture in the gallery and location access, and also IP address. With the weak privacy protection, Peduli Lindungi even couldn't protect information that being stored in their database. Last August 2021, the number 1 person in Indonesia, President Jokowi certificate vaccination was leaked through the apps. So it raised a concern of data protection, especially the misuse of that users' data. The third highlight that I want to give attention is the new regulation that becoming a new threat to the during this pandemic. So the MICT released a pass on the MR5 concerning the private electronic system operators. It is actually the regulation requires electronic service providers to grant access to their system or any data for supervision purposely whenever the authorities request it. But the problem is with MR5, government allowed to request access not only to traffic data and electronic system users information, but also specific personal data and communication content. These may include financial data, biometric data, health data, and any data on the user's political views or sexual orientation. And this MR5 also apply to electronic system operators who store their data and system outside the Indonesia. So this becomes 3 highlights that I want to communicate during this session, and hopefully it gives a clear situation of what is the state surveillance in Indonesia right now. Thank you.
So thank you, Damar, for sharing with us the highlights of how surveillance is going on in Indonesia. And yeah, I think it's similar to many countries. No? It's a question of health. It's the issue of health versus security. And yeah, maybe perhaps later on we will be discussing that. Perhaps you can elaborate on that. So from, thank you, Damar. So from Indonesia, let's go to India. So we have here Pallavi Bedi. Pallavi is a lawyer by profession, and she's currently a senior policy officer at the Center for Internet and Society, India. And her work at CIS India is primarily focused on privacy, surveillance, and data protection issues in India. Go ahead, Pallavi.
Hello. Hi. So I think I'll start with if you just start the next slide. What I want to talk about is the basic, I think like everybody else spoke about, India also started its surveillance during the COVID pandemic. Initially, they started the contact tracing applications. To take a step back, the Indian government is sort of split into the state level and the central level. And both at the central level and the state level, health under the Indian Constitution is a state subject. So basically, it comes under the state government's purview. But because of the COVID pandemic, the central government sort of got power under the Disaster Management Act, and so it became an emergency issue. Through that power, in April 2020, the central government launched its primary contact tracing app known as Arogya Setu. Around the same time, several state governments had also launched their own apps, some for contact tracing. Some of these apps was just to ensure that the person is under quarantine, or also to tell people about the hospitals next to them, or COVID hospitals, or where the doctors are. But the primary app that was developed by the central government was Arogya Setu, which uses both GPS and Bluetooth technology to trace the movement of the COVID positive patients. To register, and this came out in April 2020. And to register on the app, you need to provide certain details such as your age, your mobile number, and at that point in time, the countries that you visited in the last 30 days. All of this information is encrypted and stored on the Arogya Setu servers. So Arogya Setu server is in a central thing with the central government sort of protects or owns. This data is then assigned a static, the mobile number is assigned a static device identity number. So to each mobile number, as I mentioned, and that is also stored on the Arogya Setu server. All the other information, so the Arogya Setu sort of gives you opportunity to analyze, to sort of check yourself to whether you got any COVID symptoms, and sort of do self-check, all of that. That is supposed to be stored on the phone itself, and that's supposed not to be saved on the server. What this did, and once this app was developed, initially, and it was always been said it's voluntary and not mandatory, and that the government said we're not going to make it mandatory. They also can't make it mandatory for one simple reason that there is a huge, not everybody in India has a smartphone. The internet penetration in India is also pretty low. It's only about 50%, a little higher than 50%, and it becomes worse when you go, like the digital divide between rural India and urban India is slightly higher, is quite high, sorry. And especially there's also a digital divide across gender. So it cannot actually be made mandatory, but it's supposed to be voluntary. But this voluntary sort of became de facto mandatory in certain instances. So numerous times after they were, I think May of 2020, June of 2020, the government started revising its guidelines on how Arogya Setu is going to be used. So for example, for employees working in the public sector, they had to mandatorily download the app. They had to actually show the status of what they are, like, they had to show proof that they're not COVID positive. And that then after a while, the government sort of watered it down to show that you don't need mandatory download it, but on a best effort basis, it would be better if you do download the app. It also slowly started becoming mandatory for availing certain services, such as air travel and rail travel. So again, those circulars making it mandatory were withdrawn. But even though they were withdrawn, if you want to still go take a flight, you still have to download the app, and you still have to show the status of yourself on the app at the airport. So like I said, it became de facto mandatory. It also became, can we just go to the next slide, please? The next slide, please. Yeah, it also initially became, it was also mandatory for private sector employees, but that was also made done to a best effort basis. But that best effort basis, like everything else, became mandatory, especially for people working the gig economy. So people working the food delivery services, or working for just providing services at home. So during the lockdown, because obviously most people could not step out, you asked people to come and give you services at home. And for those services, it sort of became mandatory for them. The company themselves made it, okay, you have to mandatorily download the app. So that obviously raises privacy concerns. One reason for that is because India does not as yet have a data protection law. There's a bill which is pending in Parliament, but that's been pending for about a couple of years. We don't know what the status is. Supposed to sort of come out again, I think supposed to be passed in Parliament in December of this year. But so far, it's all being done in the absence of any law. In 2017, the Supreme Court of India held privacy to be a fundamental right. And then it very categorically said that any law or any measure by the government, not any law, any measures by the government or to curtail or to affect the right to privacy has to pass a three-pronged test. This is basically you need to have a law. The measure has to be proportionate to the aim, to the object to be achieved, and it has to be a legitimate state aim. Now, because there is no law, we don't know where the data is going or what is going to happen. It raises privacy concerns. The government has, the civil society also pushed back and has raised this issue many times. So each time the government says that the data is secure, it's safe on the server, we do not share it with any local police officials, we don't share it with any private entity. But there have been instances, there have been stories about how in certain cases the data in certain state governments by certain state government officials have been shared with local police officials or with district officials. This has also happened at, the chief ministers of certain state governments have also voluntarily shared the information, police mobile numbers or people with the police. Again, this was beginning of the pandemic. There was a pushback by civil society. There was a pushback by a lot of people. So those sort of steps have been taken. At least there's no information, but that's still going on. But there was a pushback. Like I said, like health is a state subject, and state governments had come out with their own apps. And so by end of 2020, there were 72 such apps. So most state governments had come out with some vague form of an app whatsoever. But most of them were not, some of them were contact tracing, some of them were just to monitor the quarantine, if a person under quarantine is actually under quarantine or is moving out. But so I would like to highlight two apps for this. One is, there are two by the Karnataka state government. One is Quarantine Watch and the other one is Corona Watch. Quarantine Watch came under a lot of criticism because one of the first apps that any state government had developed, and was basically to monitor the movement of quarantine patients. Can we just go to the next slide, please? So, and what an individual who was quarantined had to do was basically take a selfie every hour between 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. and upload it on the app. And then, and it's supposed to be only for quarantined persons. So we actually, at Center for Internet at CIS, we'd actually tried to, at the beginning of the pandemic, it also tried to look at these apps and see what kind of information is being collected. But fortunately, we couldn't do it because it's only supposed to be for quarantine people, at least this app. So a lot of data that they were collecting, we're not aware of. But I'll share the report with you in the link, in the chat. But what happened is that this was logged, like I said, you log in and you show that you're under quarantine. If you don't do that, the police would come or supposed to come and check on you. I don't think the app is in use so far. It's still on the Play Store, but it's not become mandatory to take a selfie any longer. But for, I think, the first 6 months of the pandemic, it was mandatory, at least in Karnataka. Similar apps were developed or were attempted to be developed by different state governments, but they never really took off. But there was an attempt by state, like I said, I'm reiterating, state governments to get information about mobile numbers, health status, who did you get in touch with, did you get in touch with anybody? The second app that I just discussed is Corona Watch, which is again by Karnataka, where they were it's used to track the 14-day movement of a COVID patient. And what it does, it basically tries to develop hotspots. So it opens up on a Google Map framework and marks the location that the infected person has visited and the report spots that they visited to basically, according to the government, to identify hotspots of COVID infection. This also, I think, both these apps, I think, are there. They're on the Play Store, but I don't think they're being used as often, at least as often as they were used in the first 6 months. They were also, at the time of the pandemic, what had happened was, because the lockdown was introduced within a matter of 4 hours, there was a lot of migration. People kept walking in and out. And so state government said, okay, we're going to have a lot of migrant population. What do we do? How do we manage that? And so they said, okay, we'll have to start generating a pass for people to move in and out and interstate traffic. And so again, there was no specified, no standardization of format. Each state government came out with its own format of what kind of information you need to give, whether you need to give mobile number, whether you need to give your Aadhaar, which is India's identification number, your unique identification number, or self-declaration. That sort of the e-movement pass has sort of stopped. But again, the data has all been collected. So we don't know what has happened to the data. So like with the apps, like with all of these things, the apps, the information that the online portals have collected, again, there is no information as to what has happened. And just to take a step back, none of the apps, except Arogya Setu, none of the state governments have actually a sunset clause. Arogya Setu does have a sunset clause in the sense it says if whatever information that you put up on the server, if you've not tested COVID positive, it will be deleted within 45 days. But there are certain caveats and exemptions given to that. Also, it could be kept if the government believes for certain reasons longer than 45 days. And again, there is no law which actually governs any of these apps or Arogya Setu or the state government or the apps developed by the state government. So like there is literally no information as to what is happening to that to the information that's been disclosed by people. Can we just go to the next slide, please?
Alavi, can you make wrap up already?
Yeah, I'm done in like 2 minutes, sorry. One issue is obviously absence of any comprehensive data protection law. And I would just like to just point out one thing is that all of these, when this app, Arogya Setu, all the state government apps, what it sort of, the effect it had on the marginalized communities in India, and also the LGBT communities, also the backward and the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe community was enormous because, like I said, not everybody has a smartphone. But when it sort of became de facto mandatory, a lot of people who were dependent on their livelihoods got affected because they didn't have a smartphone or they had to buy a smartphone or whatever. So that sort of has still had an impact, and it's been going, like people have been pushing back and why should we have why should we need to get a smartphone? What kind of information are you doing? But the impact has been primarily on, like I said, the marginalized community, especially the LGBTQ community. And like I've said, it's also in the absence of any government legislation or law. So we don't know where the data has gone. And it's, like I mentioned earlier, also, it's contrary, some of the steps are contrary to the Supreme Court judgment, which had held the right to privacy to be a fundamental right under the Indian Constitution. Thank you. And I'll just share the report the Center for CIS had done on the apps. We've done a safe survey of the apps in Arogya Setu chat box. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pallavi, for sharing, and we look forward to receiving the link for that report for the study that you did on the apps. So because we don't have much time, we'll take in questions already from the other participants. So we have questions coming in here. Let me just go back to the earlier, to the previous questions here. I think the first one is for Yiting. There's comment. There's a question here from Edmund. Why is the data or the footage? I think this is about the robot. I think data footage or sent anywhere shouldn't the legislation that the data is only to stay in the robot and wiped every day?
Yeah, I guess, with the privacy and data rights respecting state, that would be the case. So I guess the point of the robot was really to help enforce these desirable behaviors, right? Or to wipe out illegal behaviors that are considered offenses. So the rationale given by the states is that the footage is sent to these state agencies, like, the Urban Redevelopment Board, some planning agencies, housing boards, etc., so that they can break up or end these undesirable behaviors. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Yiting. And the next question is for Damar. Yes, amid the lack of data governance regime in Indonesia, what can be done to prevent data collected for the pandemic management purpose being repurposed for non-pandemic management purposes? And in your context in Indonesia, has there been any indication of how the government or would be using this data for non-pandemic management purposes?
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for asking the questions. So yes, Indonesia doesn't have a data protection law so far. We are one of the 4 countries in the Southeast Asia who didn't have the data protection law up until now. The bill itself is already being discussed with the legislative, but apparently there is a what do you call that? The discussion is stopped on the issues of who's the one have the authorities of data protection. So what I think I will suggest that when Indonesia doesn't have the data protection law, doesn't mean that we could not protect the data of the users. I will suggest that we follow the international standard whenever we will the government will deliver application. They will follow the privacy by design. That the first one means that everything should be follow on a good design relating the privacy of the users. The second one is privacy as by standards. So there is a standard of protecting the privacy. And then the third one, the data protection assessment, yeah, as seeing the impact of these collecting data users. So following these three principles actually is enough, right? In situation where there is no data protection law so far in Indonesia. And then related to the second questions, this is, I think this is the right moment to show that what happened with Peduli Lindungi as the contact tracing apps. According to this new publication from a newspaper and also media online, yesterday the government started to combine the use of Peduli Lindungi with the other private sectors. So this is becoming outside the health. It's different from the previous intention that collecting all the data related to the health concern. But now with the correlation with the private sectors, especially they can use it in Gojek, is ride-hailing apps, Gojek and Grab, but also they can use it in marketplace like Tokopedia. Even they can use it in ticket.com to buy a ticket, also with the online payment, Dana, and then Link Aja, and then even for cinemas watching movies, it becomes now clear whether this is a good example of the use of data that collect through the Peduli Lindungi. So by showing this, I think it is far more. I think this is far more than the principle, yeah, on protecting users' data. The government goes beyond that, and then the use of this data collection is worrying, because now even the regular users start questioning actually who will get the benefits of data collection of during the pandemic. Is it the people itself, or or the other parties, yeah, like the private sectors? That's I hope this is answer your question, Deborah. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Damar. I mean. So there's a reminder from that Asia here. So if you have a question or comment, you can please raise your hand. There's a raise hand function here, and then just wait for the moderator or the secretariat to unmute you to speak. Or of course, you can also write your questions or comments in the chat box. Before we go to Dr. Govind, there's just one question here for Jessamine from the Philippines, and then we'll go to Dr. Govind. So this is for Jess. Would you agree that the abuses of the Philippine state in cyberspace and even in the exercise of its police powers are being enabled by government-sponsored trolls that divide public opinion so badly that the opposition is marginalized? Trolls extol the state's actions and programs to the disadvantage of those affected. Anyway, and then there's a question here afterwards, how can the IGF help in discouraging states from engaging into cyber war or disinformation and psychological warfare? Jess, would you like to take on that question?
Yes. Thank you, Sir Bong, for the question. I definitely agree that the current policies and measures of the government are certainly skewed to benefit those who are in power. And like you said, you wouldn't find any case where a supporter of the Duterte government was arrested for cyber libel or for the spread of fake news. It's always those who are critics of the government who are charged with those cases. I think the problem, one of the major problems is the securitized approach to misinformation, disinformation related to COVID-19. So there are a lot of problems. Misinformation is a different one. Contact tracing is a different problem. Cyber libel is a different problem. But I think what the problem with the approach of the government to COVID-19 is that they're putting all of these different problems into the very broad umbrella of national security, quote unquote, and then they're employing these surveillance measures to basically solve all of these problems. So I think one of the key changes that we should advocate as digital rights advocates is to encourage the governments to veer away from the securitized approaches and look into the root cause of these societal problems. So there are many different approaches to disinformation, and I'm sure the participants here and the other sessions as well in the APrIGF would be able to address them. We could support literacy, for example, media literacy, digital literacy, but definitely employing surveillance technologies is not the answer.
So, are you done, Jess?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jess, for that answer. So we now go to Dr. Govind.
Thank you, Lisa. My question is to Pallavi. Thanks, Pallavi, for your very interesting presentation. So my question is, in the absence of the data protection law and any sunset clause, and a situation like pandemic, how the government moves for any kind of traceability and without these things, because you can't stop these things, but at the same time, you have to live with this kind of thing. There is no such data protection things or a sunset clause. So whether, what are the way outs? What are the way forward in this kind of situation?
Thank you, Dr. Govind. I think you just hit the nail on the head that traceability, contact tracing is going to go on, but obviously the way out would have been to have a data protection law, to get a data protection law, and we've sort of been waiting for that. So it says it's going to happen in December. One important thing that we could, and the government is also seeing, is that we should identify, or the app should clearly state that it's only going to be used for XYZ purposes, and that it's not, the function creep should not happen, which is what's also happening with Arogya Setu. But unfortunately, what's happening is that it's not just being limited for contact tracing. So I think the contact tracing part of at least Arogya Setu seems to have sort of gone. I don't think anybody's really using it for contact tracing. Now it's being used, for example, more for linking it for vaccination, right? We're using it to link it to COVID. Or for, at one point in time, was used as a e-movement or as a vaccine passport thing. You could move if you show that you're green on Arogya Setu, you could use it as a movement pass. So I think if you can sort of, at least if the government or any authority can at least say that we're only going to use it for XYZ purposes and not use it beyond that, in the absence of any law, that's the first step that we could take going forward, that you ensure that it's limited to the purpose that you're collecting the data from. Even on the data protection law, that's one of the collection, it should be limited, the collection limitation, the purpose limitation. It's important that either Arogya Setu or any other app that the government comes out with, or state governments come out, central government comes out with, ensure that it's limited, the data that you collected is used for a specific purpose, it's not used beyond that, and there is no function creep. So I mean, best thing is that obviously going forward is to get a data protection law and to get a law which authorizes the use of these legislations. The use of these apps. If that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thanks, Pallavi. And I think we'll have the last question because we're almost out of time. So Pallavi actually mentioned this about the issue of vaccine passport. So there's a question here. Are you in favor or not of a vaccine passport? So anybody can take on this question. Would like to go first? Maybe Pallavi?
Oh, no, I'm not in favor of a vaccine passport. I think the government of India is also, to be fair to them, has said we are not in favor of vaccine passport because it also hits the marginalized community the most. And in India specifically, it was used. And like I said, though the government has not come out with saying that Arogya Setu is going to be used as a vaccine passport, but it became a de facto thing that use Arogya Setu to show that you're clear to go, you have a green passport. Now you're linking it to your vaccine certificate. So you can use, show that you're vaccinated through Arogya Setu. There was a talk even in India about showing that you're vaccinated so that, in private sector guys said, okay, we'll only get people who are vaccinated into our, to get back as employees. So it is going to impact, and especially in the case where there's vaccine inequity. There's vaccine inequity across the world, right? So if you have such massive vaccine that people don't have access to vaccines, to say they're going to have a vaccine passport is just not fair. It's just going to lead to more inequity. People may not have access to vaccines across, and I don't especially in the down south, it is going to be a problem. So I think though on paper it might sound like you need to know people are safe and people you're working with are safe and from health perspective, but not in situation when there is major vaccine inequity. And also, if you're using a digital platform like in India where you don't have access to smartphones, you don't have access to internet, it just doesn't serve the purpose. So.
Okay. What about in Singapore? You think is there talk about having a vaccine passport in Singapore, and are you in favor of it?
Yeah, so in Singapore, there's no travel within the country, right? So our vaccine passports are really agreements with other countries. And right now we have this green lane, you call it the green lane, with Germany and with Brunei, so that we don't need to quarantine when traveling between these two countries, with several stringent measures in place. So for example, if I wanted to travel to Germany, I would have to take 5 PCR tests, 1 in Germany upon arrival, 4 in Singapore, and things like that. So I think that very much like what Pallavi mentioned, right? It's something that's built upon unequal structures and something that perpetuates inequality as well. As for larger public health concerns, I'm not sure I can comment much with regard to things like data protection. Likewise, the data protection is more linked to our contact tracing app, which shows vaccination status, which then allows us access into restaurants or not, very basic things like that. So I think I'll just sort of end on a general note of agreement with Pallavi, who has shared more insightful things. Thanks.
Yes, and maybe quick answers from Jess and Damar before we wrap up this session.
Yeah, yes, we have already have the vaccine passport for Indonesian. We call it EHAC, EHAC, and it's already implemented in the. They move the data to Peduli Lindungi apps. So now the Peduli Lindungi become like the all-in-one application regarding the COVID-19. So as the questions about will we agree or disagree about the vaccine passport? Actually, I myself I prefer not to agree with it. But now, since the government, the state already put this as a must, so everybody must download the Peduli Lindungi. Otherwise, you cannot access all the vital access for the health and also the health. And also you cannot travel to anywhere in the countries, so it's difficult for us to not downloading the app, the vaccine passport.
Okay, so a quick response, Jess, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think that the Philippines is very far from the capabilities of it is very far from being in a position where vaccine passports would benefit most of the country because like Palavi said, with the inequity both in terms of digital access and in access to vaccines, I fear that having this kind of measure would only disenfranchise those that are already disenfranchised currently. And the Philippines is still very early in its digital vaccine certificate program. I think it only launched last week or a few weeks ago. So we're very far from that.
So thanks, Jess. So yes, I think there are still many issues that we have to discuss here. There are still many questions, I'm sure, but we do not have much time. So anyway, if you have questions, perhaps you can just send it to them to the secretariat, and they'll find a way to forward the questions to our speakers. And yes, many thanks, of course, to our speakers, Jess, Damar, Palavi, and Beating. And yeah, we hope that all the participants here learned so much from this session. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.